Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio, and so far in our spell series, we've created a number of cool spells and now have the ability to teleport, to heal ourselves, and to cast some spark damage. That said, it's pretty annoying having to constantly go to the inspector in order to change which spell we're using. So this time around, we're going to add a Spell Hotbar so we can easily switch between which spells are currently active, and we'll also give it a little bit of visual polish. That's where we're headed in this video. Let's get started. Now we're going to start by creating the hotbar UI itself. So let's right click, go to UI and add a new canvas, which we can call Spell Hotbar. At this point, we're just going to click on the canvas scaler and set it to scale with screen size. And our reference resolution will be 1920 by 1080. I'm using that because here in my game view, you can see that I'm set to full HD with those values. At this point, I'm just going to create an empty under here, and this is going to be the Spell UI object, which is going to be pretty simple. It's just going to be what houses each of the slots that we use. If I click on my scene and double click on it, we can kind of zoom in on that spot, and I'll just enable gizmo so we can see how it fits on the screen. I'm just going to click on my rect transform here, hold down Option or Alt on PC, and then stretch it in all directions. At this point, we can just add a margin around the outside to kind of get it to appear where we want, and now it will be anchored to that point in the screen. We'll come back to this in just a moment, but first let's right click. We're going to add a UI image here, and we'll call this one Spellbox. I'm then just going to use Command D to duplicate that. And now if we go back to our Spell UI, we can add a grid layout group, and you'll notice that it aligns each of those squares into a nice grid. At this point, we can control the size and spacing of those. I'm going to make them each have a cell size of about 120 by 120, and just give them padding of about 25 on all edges. I'm also going to add a little bit of spacing in here, and let's go with 10 by 10, and that looks not too bad for now. If I pop into the game view, you can see that that takes up a fair bit of real estate, and I don't think I want to give any more than that to my spells. Now in this video, I'll be using two different asset packs. One is this RPG UI by Edohoshi, and the other is this free 8-bit spells pack by Marvyra. For both of these, you can feel free to donate, but if you don't, just make sure to like or follow the artists just to help them out a little bit. All right, let's get those downloaded. All right, once we've got those downloaded, we can just shift-click to drag both folders into Unity at once, and then we're going to start with the hotbar here. So if we open this one up, I'm going to go to the hotbar 34 by 34. We'll do our usual settings with 32 pixels per unit, set it to point no filter, and change our format to 32-bit. We can apply those changes and then open up the sprite editor. Now inside here, we're just going to make it so that we can slice this object so that the outsides don't get distorted if we stretch it in the future. We just do this by grabbing the green lines and dragging it inside whatever we don't want stretched. So in this case, the border as well as the shadow that goes with it. We can then apply those changes and close the editor. Now in Unity, I'm just going to delete the extra spell boxes as we're going to make one to rule them all. Now we can just drag our hotkey box in there, and we can play with our pixels per unit here to decide just how large or small we want the outside to be, and it shouldn't stretch at all because we used 9 slicing. Next up, I'm just going to right click on my spell box and add a UI image. We'll call this one Highlight. In the rect transform, I'll use the Option key again to stretch in all directions, and here I'm going to apply the highlight slot in here. But you can see that it's not looking great, so let's click on that, make it 32 pixels per unit. Make sure you use point no filter and set it to 32-bit. You'll notice though that it's still kind of acting funny, and that's because it's auto slicing this. So if we click on it, you can see that it's set to multiple. We want to just make it one sprite for all 4 corners. Once we apply those changes, we can now add the highlight and things will look much better. Next, we want to have a highlight to show the actual spell, so we'll right click on the spell box, add another UI image, and this time we'll call it Icon. Here I'm going to go into my sprite sheets and just slice them up ahead of time. Because these ones are a little lower fidelity, we're going to be working with 16 pixels per unit this time, but we'll still make them point no filter and 32-bit. We can then open up the sprite sheet. All right, so we can click on Slice, use the grid by cell size option, and use 16 by 16. I'll apply those changes, but before we go anywhere, I'm just going to name a couple of key sprites. I think this one works as a teleport, so I'm going to call it Icon Teleport, and I'll do the same for my other spells as well. Feel free to do your level 2 ones if you want. I'm just going to do the level 1s here to save time. Now that I can click on the icon and just add in the icon for teleport, which looks pretty good except that it doesn't fit quite right. So as we've done usually, we're going to stretch this in all directions and just add a little bit of a margin around the outside. Finally, and this is small, I'm just going to drag icon on top of highlight. That actually means the highlight will render above the icon if they happen to overlap at some point later on. All right, with that done, we're just going to turn this into a prefab by dragging it into our prefab folders, and then we can duplicate in order to get 3 of them. With that done, we've got our prefabs made and we're ready to get scripting. So let's head into our scripts folder, go to player, and head into spells, where we're actually going to create a new folder, which is going to be for our spell UI. In here, we are going to create a new spell slot script, which is going to control each of those boxes we created and what they display. All right, let's begin by getting rid of the start and update methods, and we're going to need to make some references here. Let's begin by making a public image reference for our icon image, and you'll notice that it doesn't like that. That's because we need to be using the UnityEngine.ui namespace. Now we're also going to need a game object reference, which is going to be for our highlight, so we can toggle it on and off. Now each slot is going to need to know which spell is assigned to it, and here we're going to make a public property, which is why we're using a capital, and this just gives us more control over how it's accessed. All right, next up we want to make sure that we are capable of setting which spell is assigned to this slot, so we'll make a setSpell method that takes in a spell SO. As soon as this is called, it will set the assigned spell to be whatever spell SO was passed in. Next, we'll make it so that our icon image's sprite is set to whatever icon we've given this spell SO. Now we just want to get the game object attached to the icon image and make sure that we turn it on, as there's now a spell here. Now we want to make sure to account for the possibility that in the future we might want to actually empty out a slot. So here we're going to create handling for if a empty or null spell gets passed in. Now if it's not null, we're going to go ahead and just set the icon. However, if no spell is passed in, we want to make sure that our assigned spell actually gets emptied out. We would also want to get the sprite for our icon image and set that as empty, and then turn off the game object associated with the icon altogether. Now, regardless of whether we're setting a new spell or emptying out a slot, we will want to make sure that it's unhighlighted to begin. So we're going to call setHighlightFalse and then create that method. This will be a public method, setHighlight, and it'll just take in a bool for either true or false and then turn the highlight on or off depending on what gets passed in. Back in Unity, I'm just going to click on my spell box and open up the prefab. And first of all, let's just rename this to spell slot, as that just makes more sense since that's what the script's called too. We can then add the spell slot component and make sure that it knows where to find its own icon image and highlight. At this point, we can head back into our scene, and unfortunately the name change won't have stuck just yet, so I'm just going to shift click and quickly change those names. Unfortunately, we can't test our code just yet, as we'll need to make a manager script to handle this. We'll call this one Spell UI Manager. Now the Spell UI Manager will be what toggles our different slots and manages them. And first of all, let's get rid of our start and update method and then create a serialized private list, which it won't like until we add the system collections generic namespace. And this is just going to be a list of spell slots. We'll call them slots and we'll initialize it as just a new empty list. Next, let's make a public void method called showSpells, and that will just take in a list of all the spell SOs we have called spells. This is the method we'll call anytime we want to update our spell hotbar. And so we're going to start with a for loop. It's just going to take in an integer for I that'll start at 0, and essentially we're just going to keep looping through, adding 1 to this variable each time until we've addressed each of our slots. So for each slot that we look at, we're just going to ask if the index we're currently looking at, which started at 0, is smaller than the number of spells passed in. If that's the case, then we'll just tell the slot that it needs to set this spell as its spell. However, if the current index is greater than or equal to the number of spells passed in, meaning we only have 2 spells but 3 slots, we want to make sure to empty that slot by passing a null value. At this point, I'm just going to get rid of my extra curly brackets, as I like how tight and clean that looks, though you can leave them if you prefer. At this point, we're going to add a new public void highlight spell method, and this is just going to be so that we can know which spell is currently assigned, and it's going to take in the spell SO that we want to highlight. This time we'll use a for each loop, as we just want to instantly do the same thing to each slot. So for each spell slot, we'll just name them slot. In our slots list, we simply want to tell that slot that whether or not it sets its highlight is going to come down to the question of whether or not its slot's assigned spell matches the spell that is currently active. If so, it'll turn it on. If not, it will turn it off. Back in Unity, let's go to our Spell Hotbar and add the Spell UI Manager. And you'll notice we have this slots spot now for our list. I'll just lock the inspector, shift click each of the spell slots and drag them in there. At that point, we can unlock our inspector. Now we're almost ready to be able to test this, but first we need something to actually send a message to our Spell UI Manager, and for that we're going to head into our magic core component. Now first off, in the last tutorial, I forgot to get rid of my spark variables when we created that spell, so let's just go ahead and erase those. At this point, we can head up to the top, and I just want to organize this, so I'm going to start by creating a header for references in general, and our player can stay there. We'll also make a public reference here to our Spell UI manager. Next, let's create another header. This will be for our spell state, and we'll include things like our current spell. But we're also going to add a serialized private list of spell SOs. Now again, we'll have to add system collections generic to do that list, and this is going to be a list of all of the available spells at the moment. And like we did with our other list, we'll initialize this as an empty list to begin. Next, let's just add back our start method, and as soon as the game begins, we want to tell our Spell UI manager that it needs to show spells, and we'll pass along the available spells. So whatever ones we want to start with, it'll get those now and put them into the hotbar. Back in Unity, let's go to our player sprite where we have this magic core component. We just want to make sure to drag our Spell Hotbar into the Spell UI manager. At this point, we also want to give him some available spells. I'm just going to grab the level 1 for each of my spells. And then just before we test this, we need to actually assign icons. So let's just click on the heal spell and make sure that it gets the icon for heal that we named earlier. We can then do the same for spark and teleport. Now when we play the game, it automatically updates our hotbar as soon as the game begins. That's working pretty nicely. Next up though, we actually want to be able to move between different spells. So let's make that happen. Alright, now in order to move horizontally along the different spell slots in our hotbar, we're going to need an integer to keep track of the current index of which slot is selected, and we'll start that off at 0. Now at this point, we're just going to make a change to our current spell. First, I'm going to make it into a property by giving it a capital, and this means that we can set different things about how it's accessed and what data it provides. So in this case, we'll add a lambda expression, and it's just going to pass along. So anytime we ask what the current spell is, it will check our available spells count and make sure that it's greater than 0. If it is, it'll pass along the available spell matching our current spell's index, so whichever one is currently selected, and if not, it will pass along a null value as we don't have any spells. Now as soon as the game begins, we do want to highlight whichever spell is currently active, so let's call highlight current spell, and then we'll have to create that method. Here, if current spell is not null, meaning there actually is a current spell, then we want to talk to our Spell UI manager and tell it that it needs to highlight the spell and just pass along our current spell. Back in Unity, I'll just click on my sprite, and in the magic component here, I'm just going to set the current index to 1, so it should highlight the middle one when we start, and it does. At this point, I can cast a spell to cast lightning, and that works pretty nicely. Next, we though want to be able to actually move side to side by pressing a button. So let's head into our input system actions, and here for our player actions, we currently have a previous and next that were sort of default ones. If you don't have those, you can add them by hitting the plus button. And I'll call this first one left shoulder. You'll notice it's already mapped to 1 on the keyboard, which works great for me. I'll then turn next into the right shoulder and make sure that it works with the hotkey of 2. Don't forget to save your asset, and then we can head into our magic component again and create some methods to support this. The first will be a public void next spell method, and it's just going to check to see if our available spells equal 0, in which case if there's no spells, we just want to return and not execute any more logic. Next, we actually want to iterate through the different slots in our hotbar. So we'll take our current index, and each time we call next spell, we'll add 1 to its value. However, if we get to the end of our hotbar, we want to go back to the beginning and wrap around. So we use a modulo operator, which just divides A by B and returns the remainder. So in this case, it will divide our current index by the number of available spells. Now, at this point, it divides perfectly. When we're at the end, it'll return a 0, which means our new index will become 0. And we can just call highlight current spell, and it will highlight slot 0. Now we want to do essentially the exact same thing for previous spells, so let's just copy this method, call it previous spell, and instead of adding to the index each time, we'll subtract. However, our modulo operator doesn't quite work for going into negative values, and so what we need to do is just add the total count of our available spells to whatever number it yields, and that'll keep us from going into negative values and getting some weird stuff happening. Now the last major piece here is to actually take in our inputs and pass them along to Magic, so let's head into Player and go all the way down to the bottom where we take in all of our inputs. Eventually we will move these into a script of their own, but we're going to keep them here for now. We'll make a public void on left shoulder. Keep in mind this works because we called our button left shoulder, and if you called yours something else, you'll have to do on that something else. This will just take in an input value, and if the value of that input is pressed, it'll pass along to Magic that it needs to call previous spell. We can then copy this exactly, but just make it on right shoulder and make sure that it calls the next spell rather than previous. Let's save that and head into Unity. Alright, now when we get into Unity, I can use the 2 to move to the right, and it will cast the spell that I've currently selected. I can also go back using 1 to the left, and again, it is changing spells appropriately, though here I'm getting in trouble with my teleport as I can't teleport inside that dummy. At this point we're more or less done, except that I'm finding the switching between spells to be less than inspiring. Let's add a little visual polish. So we can head into our spell slot at this point. So first, let's make it so our spell icons start off dim and then go brighter when we select them. For this, we're going to need a serialized private color field for our normal color. We can then just copy that and make another one for the highlighted color. And the highlighted color will be equal to white, which will just make it nice and bright. I also want to make the selected spell grow just a little bit, so let's have a vector 3 for its normal scale, which will just be vector 3, 1, which is a 1, 1, 1 on the X, Y, and Z. And then for our highlight scale, we'll do vector 3, 1, but multiply it by something like 1.2, which will add 20% to its size. Then we can come down into our set highlight method here and just tell our icon image that its color should be, and here we'll ask a question, is it active? If it is, we'll use the highlight color, and if not, we'll use normal color. We'll do the exact same thing for our size, making sure that our icon image is rect transforms local scale, and again we'll ask that question, is it active? If it is, we'll use the highlight scale, if not, we'll use normal. Alright, back in Unity, let's click on our spell slot, and now we just want to set the normal and highlight colors, so let's open up the prefab. For our highlight color, just make sure to turn your elf all the way up so that it is not transparent, and I'm going to set mine to about 70% value, which will just dim it a little. Then for our highlight color, just make sure again that the elf is at full and it's a nice bright white. Now when we get in the game, things are working as before, except that the highlighted slot is just growing and getting a little brighter to give it a little more visual flair. Alright, that's working pretty nicely, but it would sure be nice if we could actually collect different spells. So in the next video, we will add some treasure chests and make it so that you can collect different spells and add them to your hotbar. Hope to see you in that video. Until then, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.